Good morning. Excuse me. I'm pleased to introduce Brett Swanson. Mr. Swanson is president of Entropy Economics, a research firm focused on technology and the global economy, and the Entropy Capital, a venture firm that invests in early-stage technology companies. He is also a scholar at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute's Center for Internet, Communications, and Technology Policy. He previously was a senior fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, where he directed the Center for Global Innovation. For 8 years, advised technology investors as an executive editor of the Gilder Technology Report. Today, Mr. Swanson presents his exaflood research across the globe, writes a column for Forbes, blogs at techpolicydaily.com, and often contributes to the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal on topics ranging from broadband networks to China to monetary policy. Mr. Swanson studies innovation, globalization, China, internet traffic, information theory, the stock market, and entrepreneurial economics. His most pioneering and speculative research, however, concerns forces even more powerful and enigmatic, his 4 children. Today, he will present a talk titled Great Stagnation or Technological Renaissance. Please silence your electronic devices, but don't put them away. We want to see you tweeting to the hashtag Dawn or Doom. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Swanson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it is great to be here at Purdue. I spend all my time studying science and technology and its effect on the economy, and so it's really an honor to be at one of the world's great institutions of science and technology. Although I do have to wonder what my late grandfather would have said of me being here at Purdue. He was captain of the Indiana basketball team back in 1942-43, so but anyway, Purdue's a wonderful place, and I've enjoyed coming here. I live just down the road in Zionsville, Indiana. And today I'm going to talk about the technology economy. And consistent with the sort of title of our conference, Dawn or Doom, is technology sometimes seems almost miraculous, sometimes it seems very scary. There's a lot of commentary about the economy these days that sort of mirrors that dawn or doom title. You often hear, especially with the bad economy the last few years, technical innovation the last several decades has really slowed. We're in a great stagnation. On the other hand, you hear technology is moving so fast that robots are going to steal all the jobs. These seem to be paradoxical opposites. In fact, we often hear the robots will steal all the jobs if, that is, artificial intelligence doesn't wipe out the human race first. So which is it? Has innovation slowed? Are we not innovating anymore? Or are we innovating too fast? We struggle with a lot of these questions, trying to figure out what is going on with technology, and especially its effect on the economy today. So I'm going to try to go through and talk about these various perspectives, try to present some data, try to present some research, maybe speculate a little bit. But we've been thinking about these topics for a very long time. This isn't necessarily a new thing that we're trying to figure out. We're not the first ones that have struggled to figure out just what is happening with technology. How do we measure technology? How do we measure its effect on the economy? Here's a story from October of 1910 in the New York Times. It was about a contest that had just been sponsored, trying to measure whether automobiles were better than horses. And so you can see that we've been trying to figure out these things for a very long time. A 6-day test shows that motor car is in fact cheaper and more efficient than an animal. It sounds funny to us today that this was even a question, because after this, of course, last century went on to become the century of the automobile, and that was a big part of the American century in catapulting the U.S. to worldwide dominance in the economy and technology. But at the time, this was a question. And these were the sort of metrics that they were looking at. They were measuring How much gasoline and oil did an automobile consume over this several-day test? How much oats and hay did the horse consume? How far did they travel? And you can see at the bottom, the automobile did end up winning the cost of about 1.6 cents per passenger mile. It did, in fact, beat out the horse, but only just barely. So today I'm going to talk about the sort of current state of the U.S. economy. Is there, in fact, a 40-year stagnation, as some have said? Is stagnation a more recent development? Or is that idea of stagnation wrong altogether? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Moore's Law. I wrote a big paper earlier this year on the occasion of Moore's Law's 50th anniversary, sort of an assessment. What has Moore's Law meant technologically, economically over the last 50 years? Where is Moore's Law going? And what does it mean for the economy? Then I'm going to talk about the productivity gap, especially in healthcare, and posit that probably has a lot to do with what you might call stagnation to this point, but also talk about the huge opportunities in technology and healthcare. I'm going to wrap that in a larger case for optimism, in my view, talk about a number of different technologies that I think will propel the economy over the next several decades. And then I'm going to talk also about public policies that I think either encourage or discourage economic growth. And that'll be the conclusion of my talk, and talk about just how important compound growth is for living standards. First, a little bit on the sort of what you may call the dismal view. Several years ago, a terrific economist, Tyler Cowen, came out with a book called The Great Stagnation. And this was 2011, so we'd been after the financial panic, we'd been several years into the Great Recession. But his view was that actually this Great Recession was the result of a longer-term, really 4-decade stagnation, in which, there's been a lot of apparent innovation, especially in information technology, but across the board, we hadn't been innovating as fast as we did before that in transportation and energy and so forth. More recently, Robert Gordon, an economist at Northwestern University, has written about what he calls the demise of U.S. economic growth, where we're growing slower today and we can expect to grow much more slowly in the decades to come. A real downgrade in the possibilities of the U.S. economy, he said. He acknowledges the information revolution, but he says it's far less powerful than the agricultural or industrial revolutions. And in any case, he thinks that the information age may already have ended. And then I always like to bring this one up. Writing back in 1998, well-known economist Paul Krugman said that by the year 2005, we will view the internet as no more powerful than the fax machine. And we sort of chuckle at that today because the internet we think is sort of one of the real key sources of innovation. And yet at the same time, even today, people still think, as Tyler Cowen has said, that the internet is a great source of fun and enjoyment and entertainment, but not really a source of rising incomes and jobs. And so that still is a question, despite the huge role that the internet plays in our daily lives. Here's more digging down deeper into sort of the dismal view, I call it, about what's happened over the last couple decades. A lot of people say that incomes, in this case labeled as hourly compensation, since the early 70s has not kept up with productivity. So the top line showing productivity, how much output we generate per hour, is not translating into income for the average worker. There are a variety of explanations for this. They say that more of the income of the productivity that we do have is going towards people at the top, et cetera, and that the average workers aren't seeing these gains, and they think that this is a major source of declining or at least stagnating living standards and demands a robust public policy responses. Another way of looking at this dismal view, Thomas Piketty and others have argued that if you look at the average income of the bottom 90%, their view is that living standards have not risen since 1968. This is a very, I guess you'd say, widely shared argument in today's economic debate. They say, despite all the apparent innovation, incomes for the average person are not growing since 1968, they say. My own view, I think there's a lot of evidence to call into question or even disprove this very dismal view. So if you look at the data, the one reason I think these arguments are probably wrong is that they don't use the right price indexes. So if you use sort of the old crude consumer price index, you might get this dismal picture. If you use even a slightly more modern price index like personal consumption expenditures, you get a much, much healthier picture. So for example, if you just use the PCE versus the CPI, instead of a 4% growth in income over the last 40 years, you get something like 35% growth. But there are lots of other factors as well. They compare productivity apples with income oranges. They don't count total compensation. So they're just looking at average hourly wages. But our economy today is much different. It doesn't depend nearly as much on sort of hourly wages. So they don't include benefits, which are a much larger portion of our total compensation package today. So health insurance, for example. They don't count government benefits, say like food stamps. They also don't account for taxes. So taxes on the middle class have actually dropped dramatically over the last 40 years, giving us more income. They also don't account for things like realized capital gains, which are in the trillions of dollars. They also don't account for around $20 trillion that we have in 401ks and IRAs and other private savings plans. So they, in effect, undercount income dramatically and overestimate inflation dramatically. And so I think these are all things that sort of call into question this dismal view of the last 40 years and stagnating middle class incomes. Another way to think about it, real consumption per person over the last 4 decades has tripled. So how do you say have flat incomes, but we've tripled our real consumption? The other thing, and I'm going to talk more about this, is that I don't think a lot of the data, whether it's their data they use, the data I like to look at, accounts for technological innovation very well. And this isn't anybody's fault, although we can do more research and we can have better methods. It's just the nature of exponential change is very, very difficult to measure. I do think, having said that I don't think we've had a great stagnation over the last 40 years, I do think there's cause for concern over the economic performance over this last 8 to 10 years, say, especially since the Great Recession and the financial panic. Here's a data. In the gray line, you can see U.S. real GDP, U.S. economic output. And you can see here, really up until the Great Recession, which you can see there quite clearly, long-term U.S. growth rate, whether you go back to the 60s, whether you go back 200 years, whether you go back 400 years, has been averaged about 3%, maybe a little bit more per year. That's our long-term historical growth rate. You can see that since and you can see that if we had continued that average 3% growth since the Great Recession, you can see where we would be. But we haven't. We've only grown maybe 2% since then. And you can see that if the U.S. had kept growing at our historical rate, the economy today would be over $2 trillion larger than it is in 2015. That's per year in GDP. My view is that this more recent downgrade of the U.S. economy's growth rate is much more responsible for the pain that the middle class is feeling today than any 40-year trend. You can see it in a number of different data sets. This one I like to look at. Today we have the unemployment rate is 5.1%, which doesn't sound too bad. But if you look at the number of people actually working and people that have dropped out of the labor force altogether, it paints a more concerning picture. So this is the civilian labor force participation rate. And I'm not counting teenagers or college students, and I'm not counting retirees, so this tends to account for some demographic factors. We're not counting, retiring baby boomers, et cetera. We're looking at people 25 to 54 years old. And so you see this real drop in the number of people that are in the workforce. Now you can this drop started in the previous recession in 2000, but it really accelerated after the financial panic and Great Recession. And this is cause for a real concern, I think. The other thing that you can say is that although I don't think incomes have stagnated over the last 40 years, I think if you look at the median income data and account for all the factors that I looked at, there is a lot of evidence that median incomes have been stagnating for the last 8 to 10 years. Now, that's the economy today. I want to talk more about technological trends over the last 50 years and where we're going. I love this picture. It shows this is data storage circa 1956. They're loading an IBM RAM-backed storage system onto an airplane with a forklift. This data storage system had a capacity of about 3.75 megabytes, which is about equivalent to one digital song. It's hard for probably some of the younger people in our audience today to think about that. As well, IBM rented this storage system to big companies that were crunching lots of data for $3,000 a month. In fact, that'd be about $30,000 per month in today's dollar, in today's dollars. So it's fun to look at how far we've come. And I think pictures like this often can tell us more about how far we've come and about our economic, whether there has in fact been a great stagnation, than lots of data. You can look at this and see we've come a long way. Another question I like to ask, I've done some work on this, I've written a couple articles about it. Anybody in the audience born in 1995? Near 1995? We have born in 1995, 1994, 96, 90. We have a few members of the audience born in 1995. Any guesses? So an iPhone 6 today, you can buy it for a couple $100 through a carrier. If you just buy the device alone, it might cost $600 or $700. Any idea how much that iPhone 6 with its processing and storage capacity would have cost to build in 1995? Not just those born. $40,000. How many? Well over $1 million. A rough estimate, if you look at the processing power, the data storage, the communications capacity, and some of the other factors, around $5 million to make one iPhone. And now, several billion people across the planet have smartphones. In a couple of years, probably 6 or 7 billion, nearly every person on the planet will have a smartphone that just 2 decades ago would have cost $5 million a piece to build. This is another way that I like to think about how fast we are moving. Some more research that I did into Moore's Law from my paper earlier this year. Moore's Law, since 1965, when Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, wrote that first paper plotting just a few data points, saying, I think that transistor counts on integrated circuits, which were very new then, are going to keep doubling about every year, 18 months, 2 years. I think we can do it, at least through 1975, he thought. And they did it. And then they kept doing it year after year after year. And Moore's Law powered the era of the computer and the personal computer and then the internet. But about a decade ago, about 15 years ago, people started seeing a problem on the horizon. We were packing so many transistors on chips, but we couldn't continue decreasing voltages as we needed to keep down the heat problem. So chips, as they could see, if we kept going down this path, chips were going to heat up to the power density of a rocket nozzle and eventually the surface of the sun, and that was obviously unacceptable. So they thought that Moore's Law was going to run out. And in fact, as they predicted, around the year 2004, 2005, clock speeds of chips. Remember in the 90s when you used to buy personal computers, Intel would market their chips, how many megahertz was your chip? How fast was it? We used to measure chips basically by their clock speeds. That's how good we thought a chip was. Well, around the year 2004, 2005, because of this heat issue, we sort of had to level off clock speeds. And a lot of people said this is the end of Moore's Law. Chips just aren't going to keep providing that exponential growth like we thought they would, and this possibly could decrease the overall innovation and growth rate of the economy. So you can see in this gray line, clock speeds did in fact level off. But several other innovations helped compensate for those leveling off clock speeds. We developed multi-core architectures. Putting multiple processors on the same chip was one of the key innovations. And among others, this is also when we started developing parallel computing architectures through cloud computing, which spread processing over many more processors. And so if you look at a measure of processor performance, not just clock speed, but how many operations are we able to perform, you can see on the blue line that in fact processor performance did keep growing after 2005. And if you look in the right-hand scale, lower right-hand corner, you can see it in a linear scale. The gray line at the bottom is what clock speeds did, but chip performance kept growing. Another interesting thing is trying to measure the price of computation. So again, this is a problem that we have with official measures of things that are growing exponentially. The gray line, you can see the producer price index for computer chips, or microprocessors specifically. Now this is a logarithmic scale, so the official government PPI says that $100 worth of computing in 2000 could, by the year 2013, be purchased for just $1.31. Now that is, in any other field, that would be completely remarkable. Getting the same amount of processing of just 13 years before for just over $1. That seems remarkable. And yet, measured against the previous several decades of Moore's Law, it did seem like this was leveling off. You can see the right-hand part of that gray line. It does seem like prices weren't falling as fast as they used to be. Maybe this is cause for stagnation, slower rate of innovation. In fact, I don't think the government's been measuring this right. And both the previous chart and this chart are data from a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute named Steve Oliner, terrific economist. And he shows that, in fact, if you measure processing power of chips correctly, computation, the price of computation did keep falling, and the a better estimate of the measure of the price of computation in 2013 was just 4.8 cents. So in fact, we consumers today can buy 27 times more computer power for the same price than the official data suggests. This is another example of how difficult it is to measure these exponentials, their impact on the economy, and why we may be underestimating our standards of living with some of the official government income and price index data. This is just one example. This is just microprocessors. But how do we measure the cost effectiveness of software? How do we measure the consumer surpluses that we get from things like Wikipedia? All these things that we get online and from the digital world that are really for free, but we would be willing to pay for. The estimates are hard to gauge, but we probably get hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of consumer surplus per year that doesn't get counted in a lot of the official data. Suggests that we may be better off than the official data suggests. More reason for optimism, if you at how the American, especially tech economy, has done. If you look at just the value of 7 of the top American technology firms, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Oracle, Intel, the total market cap, and these numbers are from late July, so it's changed a little bit since then, almost $2.4 trillion. This is American innovation. If you compare that to the entire stock market of Germany, Australia, or India, just our 7 leading tech companies together are larger than the entire stock markets of these other major countries. This is just another measure of American innovation. Another thing, and this is, I've spent a lot of time studying this. I like to use internet traffic as a basic measure of how much we're using the internet, what is the health of our broadband ecosystem, what are, it's I think a better measure of broadband deployment, broadband speed, mobile deployment, mobile usage, as well as a better measure of actually how much value are we getting from the internet. There's been a lot of debate over the last decade about whether the U.S. had fallen behind in broadband and mobile, whether it's Asian countries or European countries. I think that this simplifies the problem a little bit. And in fact, the U.S. generates and consumes between 2 and 3 times the internet traffic of most advanced countries around the world. We're second only to South Korea, and we're probably going to pass them in the next couple of years. Pardon me. I think this is a big indicator of the health of our broadband infrastructure, as well as the health of our content markets over the internet. Looking a little bit more broadly, I think there's, despite our real challenges today, and especially since the Great Recession, I think there's a lot of reason for optimism for the next couple decades. I think, yes, Moore's Law, it is going to get a little bit more difficult to keep shrinking transistors. We've got some fundamental atomic limits. Once transistors shrink towards, and the width is just a couple atoms thick, we're not going to be able to go further on the existing way of building chips. But we're experimenting with all sorts of new materials, whether it's carbon nanotubes or graphene or gallium arsenide or germanium or combinations of these materials. new designs, more parallel processing, 3D chip stacking, using different state variables like spin and polarization and so forth. And then also the very use of macro parallel architectures. So we'll keep advancing in cloud computing and cluster computing. I think that some combination of all these things will allow us to more or less continue the Moore's Law path that we've seen over the last several decades, even if it's not using the same metrics as of transistor density that we've used. We have the Internet of Things. So think about it this way. A friend of mine, Michael Mandel, likes to say, until this point, the Internet has affected about 20% of the economy. So finance, content, media. But we're just about, over the next several years, several decades, to apply the Internet to the other 80% of the economy. So call it the Internet of Things. This will allow us to apply the productivity advances of the Internet to that other 80% of the economy that it really hasn't touched yet. That's the reason for optimism. Software will keep on, in Mark Andreessen's phrase, eating the world. We'll keep on making creative products with software and apps, and whether it's things like Uber or whether it's in healthcare, and I'll talk about that more. Virtual reality, I think, is the next phase of web content. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are going to establish better financial platforms for the web and for everything else. Energy has been a bright spot the last few years, but we can still unleash energy in even greater ways. And far from being a constraint, I think energy is still an opportunity. And then a big one that I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail, and I just wrote a paper on this that came out earlier this week. It's what I call the appification of medicine. So, and most simply, this is the transformation of healthcare into a true information industry. This is one of those things we talked about, where the internet and computation and thinking about health and medicine and biology in information terms will allow us to completely transform the industry and impact both people's health directly and see wider ripples across the economy and create more economic growth. So healthcare for the last several decades, although we have the world's best doctors and nurses and hospitals and technology, and we're very lucky in that way, healthcare is not productive. So where other industries, we get more output compared to the amount of input we get in. If you look at it, where average annual productivity for most of the economy has been about 2% over the last couple decades, healthcare productivity actually declined. We're using more people and more resources to get less out, at least as we measure it. Again, it's a difficult thing to measure. But over 20 years, that's a productivity differential of about 60%. So considering that healthcare is about a sixth of the economy, this is a real drag on our overall economic productivity and economic growth. But what if we could transform healthcare from a productivity laggard into a productivity leader? If 1/6 of the economy is transformed, it means a huge overall boon for the overall economic growth and incomes, et cetera, not to mention standards of living and overall health, longevity, living longer, better lives. And so my new paper, The Appification of Medicine, it's called 4 Facets of the Information Revolution in Health. I think about it this way, and you can organize it in your own way, but this is the way I view what's happening in healthcare. The first facet is the way that smartphones and other personal technology is, with supercomputers in our pocket, connected healthcare apps, watches, wristbands that help measure our health, implantable devices, ingestible devices that will help measure our metabolism, our vital signs, communicate it to our doctors, keep track of our data over long periods of time. Devices that will be able to look into our own ears, look into our own eyes, sense the chemical composition of our breath. These types of things are going to dramatically change the way that we collect data on health, the way that we, the ability to do self-diagnostics, the way that we communicate with our physicians and nurses. The second facet is big data and social data. So as we collect all this information, radically more information than we've ever had before, and put it in huge databases, and we are going to be able to do much better and wide-ranging research on much better collections of data and correlate this data with data going from previously, from family histories, and then integrate it, which the next facet, which I think is probably the most fundamental information technology in this application of medicine, which is our truly radical new understanding of the code of life. So obviously 1953, Watson and Crick discovering DNA, wonderful achievement. 2000, decoding the genome, wonderful achievement. But if you looked at the first 10 years after we decoded the genome, some people say that the actual practical applications might have been underwhelming. You know, in 2000, we decode the genome. A lot of people, I think, thought, well, in 5 years, we're going to have cured cancer, we're going to cure all these other diseases, but maybe the practical implications didn't come as fast as we thought. Now, 15 years afterwards, as we've done lots of work in genomics and proteomics and you know, figuring out these very complex information networks in our bodies, we are really starting to see astounding advances in treatments and cures for a range of diseases and conditions. And I think we're just on the cusp of a huge advance in the next several years and several decades. And so combining these techniques, this macro data with the micro understanding of the information inside our bodies and the way cells and our genetic code interact with each other is going to be really powerful. The last facet, which is very important to generate as much information, as much innovation as possible in the first three facets. And this is what I call the application of the business of healthcare. So today, for a variety of reasons, we sort of have a top-down structure in healthcare that's dominated by, by large health systems, by large third-party payers, whether it's Medicare or Medicaid or nominally private health insurers, and so forth. And this creates a sort of stagnant industry where you don't have as much entrepreneurship and experimentation and innovation that you have in other industries. If we can unlock this industry so that physicians are freed to use technology and create new firms at a rate that we see in other parts of the economy, so that large health systems are free to innovate, so that consumers are truly empowered with personal technology, so that we can bring down the cost of insurance by not forcing people to choose among a very small set of insurance products. If we can allow patients to become, to transform the business of healthcare to be much more consumer-centric, so people have an incentive to care about what their treatment costs, that will truly set off an innovation explosion across all of these facets, and is why I think, although healthcare has been a drag on the economy to this point, I think could be a huge boon over the next several decades. Here's just an example of the dramatic reduction in cost of, say, sequencing a genome, which is one metric, and why we're making so much product or so much progress in this in the code of life, is what I call it. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of policy for encouraging innovation in the internet, which is sort of the foundation of our digital economy. So in order for all these things to work across the economy, we've got to have this digital foundation by which we compute and communicate and all of our devices plug into. And in my view, the internet, especially in the U.S., has been a historic success story. We lead the world in digital infrastructure, consumer usage, entrepreneurship. Over the last 20 years, we've invested about $1.3 trillion in broadband infrastructure. And it really shows that a sort of a bipartisan approach begun under the Clinton administration, continued after that, has really worked. I do have a worry that today policy is reversing itself. Last winter, the Federal Communications Commission adopted a very big change in the way we regulate the internet. We've basically had, until this point, for the last several decades, a very free, open, entrepreneurial system. Now, the FCC has imposed the old Title II telephone rules, thought up in, well, before that, but first imposed in 1934, applying that to the internet. In my view, this is a huge mistake. It's in the courts right now, so we'll see. It'll take a year or two, or maybe more, to be fought through the courts. But in my view, it's exactly the wrong way to think about this vibrant ecosystem of the internet, is to propose the 80-year-old telephone rules to this amazing industry. There are going to be lots of other policy questions across the board in all our different industries, but especially the ones that are affected by the industry. Privacy, we talked a lot about that last night with Bart Gellman's keynote. Security, cybersecurity, the Internet of Things is going to have lots of surprising policy questions. It's going to, great opportunities, but also lots of surprising policy questions. Think about labor and liability law for the peer-to-peer economy, the way that Uber now is facing challenges to its independent contractor model. What are we going to do with robocars, drones, 3D printing? Today people are even, they're using Uber and Lyft to shuttle their kids around and so forth. It's great. But think about it. Once we have autonomous cars, robocars, can you put your 3-year-old in a driverless car and send them off to grandma's house? I don't know. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But there are going to be lots of these questions that Bitcoin and financial regulation, there are going to be lots of questions. Again, if we really, really want to have a rapid innovation in healthcare, we're probably going to have to change the way that the FDA regulates these things. That the current model is just not suited for the new world of information medicine. So I just want to finish up quickly, a couple minutes, on what this all means for the larger economy. Einstein was said to have said that the most powerful force in the world is compound interest. This is a guy who, the great discoverer of physical laws, but he said that compound interest was actually the greatest force in the world. And it turns out that was probably apocryphal. He probably didn't say that, but whoever said that he said that was pretty smart. Again, Moore's law, what is it? Moore's law is basically a force of compound growth, right? That's why it's so incredibly powerful. And you can see over the last couple of years, the economy growing at 2% rather than our historical rate of 3% really does create some dislocations. If we can boost our growth rate by some of the innovations that I've talked about, by unlocking a couple important sectors of the economy, we can boost our long-term growth rate, and it really has dramatic effects on incomes, on government budgets, etc. I'm going to come back to this maybe in closing. But think about this. If we continue to grow 2% a year over the next 33 years up to nearly the year 2050, compared to our historical growth rate of around 3%, the economy in 2047 is going to be $19 trillion smaller than it otherwise would be. That tells you just how powerful compound growth is. What does that mean? Over that period, growing 3% as opposed to 2.5% would generate an additional government revenue just at the federal level of $20 trillion. Now, the entire unfunded liability of Medicare is around $20 to $25 trillion. So if we could just get the economy to grow a little bit faster with a little bit more innovation, it has huge implications for government budgets over time. Another way to look at this a little bit shorter term, the 10-year difference. What if we could grow 4% for the next 10 years, which I think is possible? We could generate over $5 trillion in extra government revenue without increasing taxes, doing anything else. If we could just grow 3.5% over the next 10 years, we could generate over nearly $3 trillion. That's how powerful little increases in growth based on technology and innovation can get us. So these questions are really important for the way they affect individual lives and the way they affect our nation. I want to go back to this chart just for a second as I finish up, and then I'm happy to discuss all these things with you. Being a Catholic, I've been excited to see the Pope in the U.S. the last several days. I do think, coming from Argentina, he may not have as much of an appreciation as I'd like for the way free enterprise helps individual people and relieves poverty and create and allows the human individuals to flourish. I hope that his visit to the U.S. maybe will help him understand how the free enterprise system actually does help humans grow and flourish and alleviate poverty. If you look across the world over the last 50 years, since say Moore's Law, there are lots of complicated factors. But if you look at the way free enterprise has spread across the world, so China and India and in Africa and the former Soviet republics and South America, we have seen a dramatic reduction in poverty. We've brought probably more than 2 billion people out of poverty over this period in which technology and free enterprise is spread across the world. So it's a wonderful force for good, and I think we can keep going. And in closing, I'd say I don't think there's a great stagnation. I think we've had a little downward blip, but I think the next several decades there's much reason for optimism, and that we probably are ready for a new technology renaissance. So thank you so much for having me to Purdue, and I'd love to discuss some of these things with you. Thanks. Any questions? Challenges?
I would be interested in reading your paper about amplification, so how could we acquire that?
Sure. You can either search for it, Amplification of Medicine, Brett Swanson. It should probably come up. You can also go to my website. It's right at the top left corner of my website, which is entropyeconomics.com. And if those fail, I'm happy to give you the link after the talk here. Sure. Yes, back here. We can hear you.
First off, thanks for the talk. I largely agree with you that I think that the official numbers that are being reported look a little gloomier than what they actually are. But on the other side of that, I think that the perception that the public has about the current condition of the middle class is kind of spot on in the sense that when we think about like the generation or two before us, we were just, my daughter and I, there were just discussing recently that we had a relative passed away not long ago that lived 102 years. And over her lifetime, she went from the Wright brothers aircraft all the way up to, the internet generation and whatnot. And there were other metrics other than GDP about like human agency, like empower what an individual can do. We kind of loosely think about that in terms of like, for instance, like lifespan, how far you can travel, leisure time, things like that. I think in terms of that, over the last generation or so, that really hasn't increased very much. Like the agency of the individual today isn't that much, on average, greater than it was from our parents' generation, right? As compared to the leap in agency from great-grandparents to parents, right? So even though I think that the numbers, as you say, are probably gloomier than what the reality is, I think that our perceptions of it, as far as what we can do in terms of agency, hasn't really increased that much. And second to that, the next comment, I think that you're spot on also about the application of healthcare. One of the reasons that I believe that for extending drag, much the same way as education, I think education solving itself, is that as a society, and the U.S. even more so than the other developed countries, we have become very risk averse, and the cost of that risk aversion is not linear. So that moving from like 4 nines or 5 nines of assurance to the next 9 after that is a tremendous increase in cost, not a marginal increase in cost. So the example I like to give of that is that in 1968, if you came in with a child that had an ear infection, the probability of diagnosis and proper treatment was very, very high, well beyond 95%. You come in today, because the standard of care has evolved both through litigation and through regulation. You come in today with a child, and if there are certain conditions present, like a fever over a certain temperature or whatever, you also have to do meningitis testing and everything else like that. Well, anyone who does anything with testing knows that the majority of your tests are actually going to be false, right? That's the whole point of it, is just that, but that cost nonetheless is soaked up by the entire economy. So that little bump in risk aversion to catch that one child that has meningitis, and now it sounds kind of cold to say this, but that one instance where he did have meningitis, or she did, you're doing 10,000 tests to catch that. And that cost gets soaked up by the whole system. That's not even getting to the whole third period problem that you were talking about too. And so we are going to have to accept a rollback in the level of risk that we're going to have to accept a slightly higher level of risk for a much improved cost. And I think it's going to happen regardless. And an example of that, I was talking to Steve Lord the other day, the 23andMe company that does a la carte genetic testing, recently got smacked down by the FDA because the FDA says, hey, you guys are practicing medicine, stop it. They say, no, we're doing math. No, you're practicing medicine. Math, medicine, math. Well, I mean, I don't know the company, but from my perspective, why don't they just pack up, move offshore, right, where they're outside of the influence of the U.S. regulation on that? And how does that change their business anyway, right? And I think that's kind of the future. We've already talked about health tourism, about where people have gone to Mexico, Thailand, places like that for certain procedures. I see that as a big growth market, unless the FDA is willing to get out of the way on some of this.
Those are all wonderfully thoughtful comments. I think that is a terrific summary. A couple things just on the risk aversion. I agree with you, the FDA, the way it does things now with having both efficacy and safety and trying to prove things well beyond, and then we have all the issues of defensive medicine and so forth. That's all true, and we may have to accept a little bit higher level of risk, although what if we can put most of those tests within the hands of the consumer so that they are measuring either via, call them nanobots or sensors floating throughout our bodies or with our smartphones? What if we can do 100 tests on ourselves and do more of that through computation rather than through a visit to the doctor and a lab workup. So we can get around part of that. But I do think you're right that the FDA is going to have to fundamentally rethink this, because more individuals are going to be, sort of looking at customized solutions to their own health as we know more about our own individual genetic makeup, our own health, and we're going to have more individualized cocktails and the FDA just is fundamentally not suited today to approve or disapprove of this much more diverse way that we're going to be doing medicine. And so I'm not saying it's an easy thing to overcome, and I'm not saying they have an easy job, and you can be critical of the way they do things in some areas. But I do think we need to rethink the way we do that. But boy, your comments are really thoughtful. Yes?
You said that obviously healthcare is a major opportunity for economic growth. I'm wondering if our values as a society on privacy and the private nature of healthcare, there's been a major stagnation for healthcare, and how that is going to affect the future of healthcare.
Yeah, so privacy is a huge issue in healthcare. You talk about HIPAA, which is a very, very important thing in healthcare to protect health information. And in many ways it's very important. In other ways, you hear healthcare practitioners think, and even some patients view that it holds them back because it really makes the system very cumbersome. And in this new era, there are going to be lots more questions because we're going to be generating a lot more data. We're going to have more data about ourselves. We want our physicians and healthcare systems to have more data so they can actually use it. But it may require an adjustment among individuals and among public policymakers about today's current health privacy laws and rules. We may have to find a new balance of privacy and data for these things to be as powerful as we want them to be. And we're probably not going to go all the way in another direction, but I think there's a lot of evidence that whether it's the FDA or whether it's HIPAA or whether it's health insurance, that the structures that we have today are just not well suited for this much more personalized era that we're entering. And so, like you said, part of it is technology has a tendency to force changes on society and public policymakers, and part of it will come in that direction. On the other hand, public policy that's rigid can also tend to slow technology down. So, my view is that the opportunities, I like to say I'm sort of a dawn monger. Some people are doom mongers. I'm sort of a dawn monger. So I tend to be more optimistic about setting technology free to solve people's problems. And so I think we need to readjust that balance. But it's a good question. Any others? If not, thank you so much for having me to Purdue, and thanks for coming. Appreciate it.